So hello and welcome to yet another episode of Biographics. I'm your host, Carl Smallwood. That's Carl Smallwood. That's my real name, and it's spelled the way it sounds. K-A-R-L-S-M-A-L-L-W-O-O-D. Quite a mouthful, I know. Nobody ever expects that from a Smallwood. And today we're talking about Truman Capote, the troubled author of In Cold Blood. And since we're talking about a celebrated American author in today's video, I thought I'd bring some books from my own personal collection, which people may have noticed in previous videos, just sat behind me on that shelf to go through at various points throughout the video. But before that, and speaking of writers, the author of the script today's video is based on, Larry Holsworth, can be found at the social media links below, as can I if you are so inclined. But let's get to it. Truman Capote was a darling of the New York literary set long before he became an international sensation with the publication of his novel In Cold Blood in 1965. He had written short stories, essays, novels, and novella, contributed to screenplays, and provided critical essays on many other works. A Southerner by birth, he was a fixture of the New York social scene. After he published In Cold Blood, he found himself in demand for talk shows and public appearances. Magazines and newspapers peppered him for interviews and commentary, and as an openly gay celebrity, he was a rarity for the time period in which he hobnobbed around. Capote was not only openly gay, but flamboyantly so. He hung around with celebrities and claimed sexual relationships with celebrities of both sexes, including Errol, Flynn and Greta Garbo, attended lavish parties, and became a dominant personage in society in New York, London and Beverly Hills. Among the many celebrities he's said to have partied with included Lee Radziwill and her sister Jackie Kennedy Onassis, Princess Margaret, Andy Warhol, Bianca Jagger and Elizabeth Taylor. He seemed to thrive on little more than drugs, alcohol, gossip and controversy. He gleefully feuded with some of these celebrities he hung out with, including, most famously, author Gore Vidal, who once said of him, "Truman Capote has made lying an art. A minor art." Capote responded in kind with the comment, "Of course, I'm always sad about Gore. Very sad that he has to breathe every day." The feud continued all the way until Capote's death, which Vidal described to a press reporter as, and I quote, "a wise career move." By the end of his life, Capote had made being a celebrity pretty much the sole focus of his career, having not published really anything but a few essays since the appearance of In Cold Blood in 1966, yet he remained one of the major literary influences of the late 20th century. In 1968, Truman Capote sat for an extensive interview with Playboy magazine. Yes, the magazine really did do articles that people read it for. During the course of the interview, which covered that year's presidential election, the civil rights movement, the war in Vietnam, and his fellow writers and artists, Playboy asked him, "Are there any writers on the current literary scene whom you consider to be truly great?" Capote thought for a moment and responded, "Yes, Truman Capote." He then listed several others he considered commendable. Gore Vidal was not among them, and none ranked equally to him, at least in his estimation. Truman Capote was given the name of Truman Streckfus Persons following his birth in New Orleans, Louisiana, in September 30th, 1924. When he was 2 years old, he was sent to live with distant relatives on his mother's side of the family when his parents divorced. It ended his relationship with his biological father and led to a long separation from his own mother. He was raised by Nanny Falk, who Truman took to calling Sook, in Monroeville, Alabama. There, he was befriended by the Lee family, headed by an influential Monroeville lawyer named Amasa Lee. Truman became particularly close with the longest year child, Nell Harper Lee. Yes, that Harper Lee. Both children had taught themselves to read before entering formal schooling, and both enjoyed reading and writing. Nell Lee later modelled the character of Dill in her novel To Kill a Mockingbird on her childhood friend. Truman used Nell as a basis for the other character, Ibadell Tompkins, in his first novel, Other Voices, Other Rooms. The two remained friends for most of Truman's life until gossip over each other's contributions to their most famous works drove the wedge between them. Truman was a small, effeminate, shy child, been there, who avoided the rough and tumble play of other boys his age. Again, been there. He wrote short stories and essays. On a weekend trip to Mobile, Alabama, submitted one of his early works to a children's writing contest. He was already quite serious about his writing and spent several hours at it each day. His short story, Old Mrs. Busybody, won the contest. It was a tale of an obese woman who attempted to murder her child. Truman was just 7 years old at the time. And speaking of books, let's go into my own collection for a moment, shall we? And this is my favourite book that I own, because I bought it simply because I really dislike the phrase, "do not judge a book by its cover," and I saw a book with a 3D dinosaur on it called Z-Rex and went, hell goddamn yes. And I'm not going to talk too much about it, I'm simply going to read the blurb on the back, and you tell me if you would not have bought this book for the princely sum of £1 British. You're a 13-year-old boy on the run. A massive man-eating monster is on your tail. An evil group with a plot to destroy humanity wants you both, dead or alive. There's only one way out. You and the monster have to work together. Hell yeah. That same year in 1932, Truman was brought to New York City to live with his mother and her new husband, Jose Garcia Capote. They settled at first in an opulent Park Avenue apartment overlooking Central Park. Capote was a former Spanish colonel who invested in New York real estate who adopted Truman and bestowed upon him his last name. The colonel was not available as a father figure for very long, and shortly after Truman arrived in New York, Jose was arrested, charged and convicted for embezzlement. Mother and son were forced to leave the Park Avenue apartment for less expensive rooms, first in Brooklyn and then on the Riverside Drive in Manhattan. Truman enrolled at Trinity College, entering the 4th grade there in 1933, and over the following 3 years his grades dropped steadily, though they remained sufficient to pass him on to the next level. Concerned over his studies and his effeminate nature, his mother enrolled him in St. John's Military Academy in Ossining, New York in 1936. There, she again more or less abandoned him. Truman would later recount that she visited him at the school only twice, and wrote, "I would have been much happier if my mother had just left me in Alabama." In 1939, the Capotes moved to Connecticut, where Truman attended Greenwich High School. There, he wrote for the school newspaper, though he performed poorly in studies not related to English and composition. 2 years later, the Capotes moved yet again back to New York, and Truman was enrolled in the Franklin School, a private institution now known as the Dwight School. He completed his high school studies in 1942. While attending Franklin, Truman obtained a part-time job working as a copyboy at the New Yorker. An editor at the magazine described his appearance thusly: small and frail in appearance, he's less than 5'3" in height, beardless and possessing a high feminine voice. So high-pitched it was said that the only thing that could hear him were dogs. And if anyone has not heard Truman Capote speak, I highly recommend doing so, and then go watch that episode of The Simpsons with the dental plan. And he sounds weirdly similar to like the guy with the reedy voice. I'm not saying I'm not one to make fun of the way people's voice sounds, given how I sound, but just I could not unhear how similar he sounds to the guy in the dental plan Simpsons episode who just keeps saying nay. He was like, all opposed? Nay. It's like, who keeps saying that? That guy, he sounds so much like him. Anyway, throughout his childhood, during those times spent with his mother, Truman was tortured by his clear homosexuality and attempts by his mother, teachers and counsellors to cure him of it. Yeah, that kind of sucked back then. He resisted such attempts, coming to resent them. He did not openly admit that he was homosexual, but he opposed any attempts to discuss his personality or his sexual orientation. When he dutifully entered the draft in 1942, the army rejected him as 4F. According to Truman, this is because he was too neurotic. Beginning in 1943 and continuing throughout the World War II years, Truman wrote a series of short stories which appeared in the major literary and entertainment magazines of the day. His work gained the attention of literary critics, usually drawing praise and demand as his stories grew. Dissatisfied with short stories, he expressed a desire to spend his time and attention on a full-length feature novel. It was following the publication of his short story Miriam, which appeared in Mademoiselle in 1945, that Bennett Cerf, the influential co-founder of Random House, offered Truman an advance to complete a novel. With $1,500 in hand, about $25,000 in today's money, Truman left New York and returned to Monroeville to complete a novel he'd been working on titled Summer Crossing, set in New York, which of course you needed to be in Monroeville to write about. In Monroeville, Truman encountered difficulties in completing the novel, and while visiting childhood haunts, he found inspiration for an entirely new story, set in the South. He set Summer Crossing aside and later claimed to have destroyed the manuscripts. In actuality, in 2004, the unfinished manuscript was found, completed by editors, and published to critical acclaim in 2006. Truman began his new novel in the familiar surroundings of Monroeville, though he did not complete it there. In the course of writing the novel, he moved several times, first to New Orleans, then Saratoga Springs, New York, and several other locations, eventually completing the work in Nantucket in Massachusetts. He later described the novel as semi-autobiographical, an attempt to exorcise demons. Childhood friends appeared in the book, most notably Nell Harper Lee in the form of a southern tomboy, Ibadel Tompkins. Gradually, the main character, a 13-year-old Joel Knox, comes to terms with his own homosexuality as the tale unfolds. He titled the work simply Other Voices, Other Rooms. Published by Random House in 1948, it was heavily promoted prior to its release, and it opened at number 9 on the New York Times bestseller list. It remained on the list for some 9 weeks, selling over 26,000 copies after its initial release. Critics were widely impressed, and reviews were highly favourable, both for the story and for the voice of the writer. Capote was compared favourably to writers such as William Faulkner, Oscar Wilde, and even Edgar Allan Poe. The subject matter of the book was not without its controversy. This was the 1940s after all, and the combination of favourable reviews and taboo subject matter made Truman Capote a huge success in literary circles. Yet, not all reviews were kind. George Davis, a writer and editor, commented on the book, "I suppose somebody had to write the fairy Huckleberry Finn." Again, this is the 1940s, and stuff back then sucked. Promotion of Other Voices, Other Rooms led to the beginning of Capote's lengthy feud with Gore Vidal, as well as other writers. He never forgave George Davis for his comment and eventually skewered him in an unfinished novel, Answered Prayers. Though he was famous in literary circles in those pre-television days, he remained relatively unknown. Numerous organisations, including the Catholic League of Decency and the Christian Science Monitor, banned the book, and libraries across the country refused to carry it on their shelves. Sure, I'm glad we passed the days like that, eh? We live in more enlightened times where people have access to knowledge and works from people whose experiences differ from their own. Speaking of which, let's go to another book in my collection, shall we? This one is called Canine Corps by Kenneth von Gurdon. It's the fourth in the SF Adventure series. Again, I bought this because they always say never judge a book by its cover. You tell me you would not buy a book with a dog fighting a velociraptor on the front. Let's go. The blurb. First you party, then you die. As a reward for yanking a giga-billionaire off a prison satellite, Ray Larkin and his team earn a month's R&R on the universe's ultimate party planet. I should note that Ray Larkin's team is a bunch of super smart dogs. But Neverland isn't all fun and games. No more than a few fleeting nanoseconds after landfall, Ray and the dogs find that the Play Planet's simulated war games can become murderously realistic at the push of a programmer's buttons. Canine Corps. They are the best freelance space scouts in the galaxy. Genetically altered dogs with enhanced senses and the gift of speech. They are Beowulf, Grendel, Mama San, Garwain, Ozma, Robin, Frodo, Sinbad, and Taji. They stand together beside Ray Larkin, a human leader against any danger, anywhere, at any cost. And who says you can't get good literature for, again, less than £1 at a charity shop? Truman Capote remained busy following the success of Other Voices, Other Rooms. He published a novella, The Glass Harp, in 1951, and the following year produced it as a stage play. In 1953, he co-wrote, along with producer and director John Huston, the script for the film Beat the Devil. The film starred Humphrey Bogart and Jennifer Jones. Capote and Huston wrote the script as the film was being shot, producing the next day's script following shooting each day. The actors weren't given their lines until just before their scenes were performed. This, shall we say, unusual approach gave the film a camp quality, at least according to a review written decades later by famed critic Roger Ebert. Capote then accompanied the Everyman's Opera on a cultural exchange tour of the Soviet Union, where they performed Porgy and Bess. Capote was sent on tour as a reporter for The New Yorker, which originally printed his articles in 2 installments in late 1955 and early 1956, respectively. Random House later published the articles in a single volume titled simply The Muses Are Heard. This was Capote's first work of a journalistic nature and foreshadowed his use of artistic license in a reported piece, which he later expanded on in his most famous work, In Cold Blood, but we'll get to that in a moment. In 1955, Truman Capote moved into a basement apartment in Brooklyn Heights in a large Greek revival house owned by a Broadway set designer. It was in that apartment where he wrote several of his later short stories, Breakfast at Tiffany's and In Cold Blood. Several of his stories appeared in magazines accompanied by photographs of the author taken in his home, and visitors to his home were frequently surprised to learn that he occupied only the basement apartments, and he delighted in leaving the impression that he actually owned the entire house, though he did not. In 1958, Capote published a novella and 3 short stories in a combined volume titled Breakfast at Tiffany's, a short novel and 3 short stories. Okay. Not very creative there, Capote. These stories were House of Flowers, A Diamond Guitar, and A Christmas Memory, the latter being an autobiographical story reflecting Capote's years living with his mother's relatives in Alabama during his early life. It has since become a holiday classic, recorded numerous times, including by Capote himself in 1959. The story has subsequently been adapted for the stage and television into a full-length musical and a one-act opera. Yet it was the novella Breakfast at Tiffany's that drew the most attention at publication. After reading the novella, author Norman Mailer said that Capote was, and I quote, the most perfect writer of my generation. He writes the best sentences word for word, rhythm upon rhythm. Mailer predicted that Breakfast at Tiffany's would become, and I quote, once again, a small classic. I'm sure none of these things gave Capote a massive ego or anything like that. The novella provided a title for a 1961 film starring Audrey Hepburn and George Peppard, although it bore little resemblance to the actual written story. And I would be remiss if I did not mention, who's not mentioned in the script here, Mickey Rooney, and perhaps his most famous role was Mr. Yonoshi, role that the New York Times described as colourfully exotic. Yeah. Capote was dismissive of the film and of Audrey Hepburn depicting Holly Golightly. He claimed to have based the character on a woman who rented an apartment in the same brownstone as him in post-war New York, and that Holly Golightly was his personal favourite of all of his fictional characters. Despite all of these hints and years of fan speculation, Capote never revealed the actual inspiration for the character, preferring instead to let people just guess, I suppose. He was living in Brooklyn when he read an article in the November 16, 1959 edition of the New York Times. The article, which ran only 300 words, described the unsolved murder of the Clutter family in the small town of Holcomb, Kansas. The Times quoted the local sheriff as claiming, and I quote, "This is apparently the case of a psychopathic killer." According to Capote's later telling of the tale, he approached his editors at the New Yorker proposing a story based on a novelized telling of the factual story. Others have disputed this, claiming the editors offered Capote the chance of covering the story or another based in New York. Capote was aware enough of how he impressed people meeting him for the first time, as well as the suspicions harboured by small-town denizens for strangers, particularly those from big cities. Gaining the cooperation from the residents of Holcomb would be difficult for just him alone, so he asked his longtime friend, Nellie Harper Lee, to accompany him to Kansas. Lee had been living in New York since the late 1940s, but retained her southern accent and mannerisms, both of which had long since been shed by Capote. Lee agreed to accompany Capote to Kansas. They arrived in Holcomb days after the funerals of the two murdered Clutter family. They visited the scene of the murders, interviewed friends of the family, investigators, business acquaintances, and former employees of the Clutter farm. Capote took no notes, recorded none of his interviews. Lee did, taking copious notes, sketching the murder scene, and recorded a journal summarising each day's activities as they researched the crime. Now, how much Harper Lee contributed to the research that led to In Cold Blood has been debated ever since. Capote himself would later claim that he had trained his memory to the point he was, and I quote, "a human recording machine with a tested ability to retain over 90% of what he was told." In a Playboy magazine and in other publications, he claimed this ability allowed him to communicate more effectively with those that he interviewed, his rapt attention putting them at ease. Curiously, he did not reveal this extraordinary ability until rumours of Lee's contributions to the finished work swept through literary circles in 1970s. Capote responded to the rumours in a sideways fashion, relating his version of the extensive research that went into In Cold Blood in the first person singular and never mentioning Harper Lee at all. By the time In Cold Blood was published, he had spent 6 years on the project, which he excused by claiming he'd been waiting for the case to be resolved in the courts. During the interim, he visited the killers Richard Hitchcock and Perry Smith in prison and became obsessed with Smith in a case of sexual attraction, which varies to a degree depending on the source you consult. Capote attended their execution by hanging in 1965, telling Playboy, "It was the worst experience of my life, period." First published as a 4-part serial in The New Yorker beginning in September 1965, In Cold Blood was an immediate sensation. It was published in a book form in January 1966 and shot to the top of bestseller lists around the country. Capote claims to have created an entirely new form of writing, the non-fiction novel. It was neither the first in the genre, nor was it entirely non-fiction. Later research and commentary by those described in Capote's book challenged the veracity from the very beginning. Although the basic thread of the story was true to the events as it said inside of the book, Capote created conversations, shifted events in the timeline, and described incidents which just never took place. In 1966, while the book was still selling well, Esquire published an article by Philip Tompkins which described the author's conversation with some of the Holcomb citizens that refuted Capote's version of events. Jack Olson, for example, a noted journalist who wrote extensively in the true crime genre, was quoted in Esquire as saying, "Capote completely fabricated quotes and whole scenes. Even the prosecutor who convicted Hitchcock and Smith claimed Capote's version of the story was, at best, misleading." While the book sold well, reviews were often not so kind. The New Republic called Capote, and I quote, "the most outrageously overrated stylist of our time." Tom Wolfe described the book as the promise of gory details and the withholding of them until the end. In 1967, a film version of In Cold Blood was released based on Capote's work. Later films explored the relationship between Smith and Capote, a subject ignored in Capote's book in the 1967 film. Whisperings regarding the contributions that Harper Lee did not receive credit for began in literary circles as the book was still on bestseller lists. Truman Capote dedicated In Cold Blood to Harper Lee and Jack Dunphy, his longtime partner. By this point, Lee was already internationally famous as the author of To Kill a Mockingbird, and while she did acknowledge having accompanied Capote to Kansas and assisting him in his research, she did nothing to further malicious rumours of being more deeply involved in the book. On his part, Capote simply ignored any queries regarding Lee's contributions and insisted the work was entirely his own. He also ignored rumours which circulated around the same time that he had assisted Lee in the writing of her novel, allowing them to continue to swirl rather than deny them. Capote would later be quoted as saying, "No one will ever know what In Cold Blood took out of me. It scraped me right down to the marrow of my bones. It nearly killed me. I think, in a way, it did kill me." Following the success of In Cold Blood, Truman Capote worked sporadically on some other short stories, essays, and another novel titled Answered Prayers, which remained unfinished as mentioned. He became famous as a celebrity, hosting lavish parties, attending others, and becoming a fixture on talk shows on television. He could always be relied on for a tart quote delivered in his unmistakable lisping drawl. When asked if he was happy, he once replied that he wasn't unhappy and only imbeciles and sweet idiots wandering around in the sunshines of spring days are happy. He referred to the American middle classes quite famously as Hagridden. He was a long-time romantic partner with another writer, Jack Dunphy, though they maintained separate homes in New York. Dunphy later wrote that one reason they did not live together was to spare him the pain of watching Capote's descent into drug addiction and alcoholism. In the 1970s, Capote purchased a home in Palm Springs, California, and began to spend more time there, effectively ending his relationship with Dunphy. In 1972, Rolling Stone magazine commissioned Capote to cover that year's American tour by the band, the Rolling Stones. Capote travelled with the band during the tour, which gained considerable notoriety for his extensive drug use and large parties of groupies. Capote's demands for special attention and services, shall we say, aggravated some of the touring party, and Keith Richards is said to have threatened Capote with physical violence. After the tour, Capote refused to report his observations and write the article he was paid to do. Rather than return the advance, he instead granted an interview with himself to the magazine, conducted by his good friend Andy Warhol. Okay. He made several attempts at drug and alcohol rehabilitation to little real effect. In the early 1880s, he began to suffer hallucinations and seizures. He became something of a recluse, and during the summer of 1984, he went to California, staying at the Bel Air home of Joanne Carson, the former wife of talk show host Johnny Carson. He died there on August 25th, 1984, reportedly of liver disease. Most of his estate went to his former lover, with the proviso that upon Dunphy's death, the estate would be used to create and fund the Truman Capote Charitable Trust, supporting both critics and writers with grants, scholarships, and awards. His long feud with Gore Vidal continued to the very end, with Capote egging on Vidal with biting remarks. "Oh, I couldn't care less," he once said after being informed of one of Vidal's statements. "Whatever Gore says about me, I think the same thing about him." And to end on, a quote from the man himself. And once, when asked to describe himself, Truman Capote referred to sainthood and added, "But I'm not a saint yet. I'm an alcoholic. I'm a drug addict. I'm a homosexual. I'm a genius." So I hope everybody at home enjoyed this video and found it educational, entertaining, and informative. I certainly found the script to be all three of those things and invite you to follow the writer on social media if you agree. And while you're down there clicking things, why not leave a like or comment with feedback, suggestions, or ideas for future videos. And as always, you can subscribe for more videos like this.